Funding for the production of Friendship Flight was assisted by Hannay Reel's Westerlo, New York, serving fire, industrial, and fuel markets worldwide that handle hose and cable for over 50 years. And by Turbine Services Limited, Ballston Spa, New York. And by Carl Grimm of Troy, New York.
November 1985 saw a landmark meeting between Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan. In the eyes of the world, the governments of the Soviet Union and the United States of America were once more trying to build a bond of friendship. Discussions brought about agreements on cultural exchanges, like the Empire State Institute for the Performing Arts visit to Moscow in January 1986. Another important step towards bridging the gap between the countries was the renegotiation of commercial aviation links. State Department negotiator Samuel Keiter explains what precipitated discussions.
Essentially, the desire of the Soviets to have commercial air service between our two countries again. I think that they wanted it for a series of reasons, not least of which was prestige. Pan American, which was the U.S. airline prior to the suspension of service, had already suspended its service before the Aeroflot service was suspended, and that was purely for economic reasons. So that if there were to be a new civil aviation agreement, we wanted to make sure that that didn't happen again, at least not for reasons that we could prevent.
A precursor to the results of the summit was an extraordinary expedition completed on June 25, 1985 by a resident of Del Mar, New York, Dr. Millard Harmon.
I'll tell you, the Soviets are bright. They put some of their most charming people in charge of that jail.
Despite this odd reference, Dr. Harmon had, just a few days before, successfully and legally flown his private plane across the Iron Curtain and into Moscow. This was a unique feat in aviation history.
He is certainly pioneering, we might say, the USSR sport aviation relationship. He is doing a great deal to you might say, bring about and maintain this warmth that is presently very evident. And as long as he keeps this up, I can see nothing but good coming out of his work.
It was a sign, or would have been a sign if we had been looking for one, that the Soviets were indeed interested in improving relations in the aviation area.
The symbolism of flight in and of itself indicates a freedom, opportunities that all of us have aspired to, that only the flyers really achieve. And there's a symbolism also of commonality between two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, of different political ideologies, but that must, for the sake of the world, coexist. Sometimes that's called détente.
On June 12th, Mill Harmon embarked on a personal mission of friendship to the Soviet Union. I tagged along as observer. The starting point was Dayton, Ohio, hometown of those pioneer aviators, the Wright brothers. The morning began with a visit to the Aviation Hall of Fame, where Mill picked up gifts for officials he hoped to meet in Moscow. Paul Leonard, mayor of Dayton, received him in his office and gave him a gold medallion for presentation to the mayor of Moscow.
Take the medallion with you to your friends in Moscow as a symbol of this journey. We would appreciate it.
I can't think of a more appropriate symbol of friendship.
For lunch, Mill was taken to an armed services manufacturers' luncheon at which he was invited to speak.
The fact that officially dealing with the Soviet Union can only be done from strength. But as a retired school teacher and educator, my interest is to have more contact with the average Soviet citizens, and on that basis, I think the relationship is far better.
A further gesture of friendship was made by Dayton artist Pat Whip. Mill was to pass on this picture of a bald eagle to the head of the Soviet Sport Flying Club, General Titov. An afternoon press conference took place at Dayton Airport.
I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind that it's not easy to fly a light aircraft into Moscow.
Mill Harmon, a retired education administrator, would attempt to fly into the record books as the first private pilot in his class of plane to fly the Soviet skies into Moscow. One final reception took place just before takeoff. Mill was able to watch himself on the news.
Dr. Harmon's flight plan calls for him to hopscotch his way from the birthplace of aviation to New York, Iceland, and across the Atlantic to Europe, arriving in Moscow by June 18th.
I find the Soviet average people very fine and honorable, and I think there ought to be more contact. And if I can use 10 Romeo as just a very small instrument toward détente, then this will be time well spent. I've been a part of this world, this complicated East-West situation now for the 40 years that it's been escalating. And I've been one of the few people, I think, in our society that's had a chance to get into the Soviet Union and rub shoulders with some of the average people, and I find they are delightful. The kids, the youngsters in the schools in the Soviet Union are absolutely delightful. In our country, we began to find that there was a real question about our educational system simply because the Soviets put a Sputnik up ahead of us. There was question about whether or not maybe the Soviet schools are better than our schools. I mean, otherwise, how could the Soviets have done this miracle ahead of us if they didn't have a whole better system backing up the whole process? And at that time, I was a graduate student at Boston University, and I thought, well, why don't I just go over there and see what I can find out in terms of this kind of comparison. This is 1958. I was among the first few people to get into the Soviet Union after the Berlin airlift. I did my doctorate and I satisfied the committee, although I wasn't happy with the report, but I sufficiently managed the research and the pictures and the interviews that I had picked up throughout an extensive traveling program in the Soviet, all the way out to Irkutsk and back, and ended up with a doctorate. And then I moved into serving New York State, the SUNY system. I got my first 300 hours of flying in the Air Force, although I had my pilot certificate before I joined the Air Force. The day I was old enough, as a matter of fact, to qualify, I had it. But I dropped out of that as I pursued my professional interest. In 1965, I got back into the business of flying. Then it began to dawn on me that it might very well be appropriate for me to do an educational update on that research I did 25 years before. So I began to plan that in 82 and 83. And as a matter of fact, went back to the Soviet Union and did the same route, visited some of the same schools. And the Soviets were absolutely delightful. Some of them even admitted to having remembered my earlier visit. You know, now that's bending over backwards, I think, in terms of being friendly. But of course, the other side of that is that there weren't very many people in 1958 that were visiting schools, and the chief, the principal out in Irkutsk, set up quite a party. We had a reunion out there that was delightful. But as I traveled around and got my feet on the ground and began to take a look at the Soviet schools that I'd seen before, I had begun to think, you know, I'd like to fly my airplane into this country. I had begun to have some friends within the Soviet Union, and I was mighty eager to share with them this piece of fantastic equipment.
This is wonderful. I really support Millard's interest, which is a long-standing one in improving international relations through people-to-people contact, going way back more than 25 years.
Taking off into the gathering gloom of night, 10 Romeo was to have a fast but blind flight to Albany, New York. Harmon spent most of the 3 hours and 11-minute trip flying on instruments alone through rain, snow, and icing conditions. Harmon claims that today 10 Romeo is the best equipped private single-engine aircraft in North America.
The process of bringing the equipment in that aircraft up to where it is now was kind of long and tedious. When I first bought it, I had no additional money for equipment. Then back in 1978, I had a good friend of mine, Jim Emery, who decided to run for the Republican leader of the Assembly.
Mill joined Emory's staff and, in addition to other duties, used 10 Romeo to fly the Republican leader around on business when state aircraft were unavailable.
And as I did that, I began to realize that probably in the process of flying the Republican leader of the New York State Assembly around, I really needed much better equipment than I had in the aircraft. And it was at that point that I began to update the panel. Now, I really don't know. There probably were 3 or 4 points in the process of updating the aircraft where there were critical decisions that had to be made. And in every instance, I went the high road with the more sophisticated equipment, the more expensive equipment, and in each case it worked out very well, because in many cases, had I opted for less sophisticated equipment, it would have been hard to build on it and move the equipment profile up to the present status that it's at. With my instrument rating and with the kind of equipment that I have in this aircraft, I found that we could manage in almost every instance without having to delay important trips because of weather or fog or whatever.
A wet Thursday the 13th heralded the start of leg 2 of Friendship flight. The press gathered at the airport in Albany, New York to see 10 Romeo off.
He tried the same thing last year, but when he arrived in Helsinki, Finland, ready to fly the last leg into Moscow, the Soviets refused to let him in. I asked him when he'd know if they'd let him in this time.
Probably the morning of the 18th when I stand on that ramp in Helsinki, and if I see 2 Soviet pilots or a navigator and a radio man walking toward me, I'll know I'm going to fly Red Airway 1 into Moscow.
Harmon says he has made 2 trips to the Soviet Union by commercial airliners since his last flight, and he is optimistic that perhaps this time he'll be successful.
We had some help. Sam Stratton called the Soviet ambassador's office Monday, and that may help things go smoother.
Steve Honeybill, the director-producer at Channel 17, is going along on this trip to take pictures and document. Harmon will have to fly over some pretty long stretches of cold North Atlantic Ocean on their way to the Soviet Union. An engine failure would mean ditching their aircraft and climbing aboard a raft they are carrying.
Want him to go, and yet I knew that he had taken all the safety precautions that he could. The plane had good equipment and was in good condition. He had all the maps he needed. He kept himself up to date for flying skills. So there really wasn't anything more I could ask of him in that regard.
On retirement, Mill decided to further upgrade his plane to allow him to fulfill some of his own dreams.
It was begin to move quite quickly towards equipment sponsors, where I have some of the top aircraft industries that have become sponsors with me on the equipment that are in this aircraft, that's in this aircraft.
Well, I think when you look at a plane like Dr. Harmon's, it is a prime example of an aircraft that is used in the United States for business purposes, for small companies going between different cities in the United States or in other parts of the world, for that matter. It's also an example of an airplane that's used by individuals. It's a typical type of owner-flown airplane, as we call it in the United States, which is used by a businessman for his business, is used by an individual for personal transportation. And the Soviet Union doesn't have this, and I think that is one of the big differences between our countries. Our air transportation system here in the United States, we've got 215,000 general aviation airplanes in the United States. This is a segment of air transportation in the Soviet Union they just don't have. And I think this is one of the values of Dr. Harmon's flight. It's opening up a whole new world, you might say, for them to see how an airplane can be used.
Satisfied with his equipment, he attempted to fly into Moscow in 1984. Despite a personal investment of $50,000 in equipment and traveling expenses on the carefully planned trip, his venture was aborted in Oslo, Norway. On landing in Norway, a telex was waiting, forbidding him use of Soviet airspace. The abortive trip did bring Mill and 10 Romeo 28 world and U.S. national speed records, however.
The atmosphere was not good between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1984. Andropov, the leader who had succeeded Brezhnev in November of '82, had died earlier in the year from various medical complications. Chernyenko succeeded him. He was also an old man, an infirm man. He didn't appear to have good, firm control of the new leadership. Policy was muddled, no doubt because of his own illnesses, and by the summer of '84, his infirmities were evident to anyone that saw him in public. At times like that, they do not tend to take risks or change policy. They tend to maintain the status quo. The status quo would, of course, preclude an individual American flyer flying in on any kind of mission.
The flight up into Canada was uneventful apart from some minor icing and the fact that we were in the clouds almost all the time. Mont Joli, Quebec, was our next point of reference for a speed record. Using the sophisticated navigation equipment, I lugged us overhead at 7,000 feet. The time, 17:30 hours GMT. Elapsed time Albany to Mont Joli, 2 hours 43 minutes. A time that would later be confirmed as a new world record. Commenting on the costs of his previous attempt at flying into Moscow, Mill said,
If I had known exactly what this was going to cost, and if I'd known that I wasn't going to get any more help than I got, I might very well not have done last year's project. I expected that there would be some major support for this project from others that are interested in Soviet-American improvement of relations. But in the meantime, when none of that cash appeared, I simply went down and remortgaged my house. I really have no difficulty in terms of my wife's support financially on these exotic projects that I become involved in.
Money isn't a big thing with me. And as long as he knew how he was going to pay for it, that's always been my criteria for whether we'd do something. And he's always done kind of interesting, innovative things that other people wouldn't think of doing. I think when one retires, you don't usually think of putting a second mortgage on your house. But eventually, you know, he knows how he's going to take care of it. And so that's all right with me.
Second time around, he's sure he can pull it off. And this time with relatively little expense.
You know, in a way, Steve,
Talking about the conversations he had with his insurance company before last year's flight.
Last year, when I told them I wanted to fly to Moscow, boy, they started giving me all kinds of questions. And these questions, I didn't realize it at the time, but these questions were directly related to the amount of cost for the insurance on that aircraft to go to Moscow. And if I'd have known that, I might have tempered some of my responses. But they said, how much experience have you had in flying oceans? I said, I've never flown an ocean in a single-engine airplane before, but I said, I don't think that Continental engine in that airplane cares whether it's over water or land.
Our first sighting of water was the mighty St. Lawrence Estuary en route to Labrador. 10 Romeo screamed on at full speed, Mill showing great confidence in his plane. For my part, thoughts of the engine quitting made me wonder about putting down in the desolate rocky wilderness below. There was no sign of habitation or human presence of any kind. While setting up the camera for this shot, I all but gave Mill a heart attack. I was leaning against the cargo door. Not a very smart move. Mill's complacency was replaced by efficient alertness.
You know, I find that the adrenaline flows by all kinds of increased amounts, and I found myself busy and really enjoying the trip immensely.
The beautiful weather made it perfect for a timeline pass by the control tower at Goose Bay. This was our next checkpoint, an overnight layover. The downhill run from our cruising altitude made us go even faster until we reached the maximum permissible airframe speed. The plane began to shake alarmingly before Mill throttled back. Elapsed time from Mont Joli was 2 hours, 40 minutes, and 54 seconds. On the ground, an inspection of 10 Romeo revealed an oil leak. Fortunately, we found some mechanics in the Labrador Airways hangar to look at the problem. They apparently remedied the situation by replacing the #1 cylinder rocker cover gasket. It was a seller's market. It cost $50 for the prompt service.
We replaced that gasket, and Then we're going to clean this, clean the engine up, get all that oil out of it that's been leaking. Then what we'll do is I'll take it around the pattern once and bring it right back here so that they can take another look at it. And if we bring it back and it passes their muster, we're on our way tomorrow morning.
A full-power trip around the flight pattern confirmed that a major part of the problem was solved. Early the next morning, the weather was miserable as we set out from Goose Bay. We climbed right into clouds, forcing us to concentrate on navigation, a task that would engross us both for many hours from then on. At our first reporting point, Loach, latitude 55 degrees 31 minutes north, 57 degrees 1 minute west, we tried but failed to contact Moncton Air Traffic Control Center on the VHF radio. Then we tried Gander radio on both VHF and high frequency, and finally on the international distress frequency, all with no success. I, for one, was glad the engine sounded good. The shadow outside revealed our problem. The radio antennae had collected ice, limiting our transmission distance. Unlike the wings and prop that we could remove ice from, the antennae were beyond our control. 15 minutes later, we made contact on the distress frequency with People's Express flight number 10, some 30,000 feet above us. They kindly relayed our position to Moncton Center. It was a relief to both of us to be in touch with the outside world once again. Clambering to the rear of the cabin to change tape, I discovered a fuel leak from the internal tank. Stemming the flow speedily was critical. Tightening a connector solved the problem. However, we were forced to eject some articles saturated with fuel to reduce the explosion and fire risk.
When I find myself in an emergency in the aircraft, and there have been 3 or 4 such events, I find that it's as if I exist within a cocoon of very quietude where I do my thing, which is to work with that aircraft in turbulence or whatever the problem is at the moment. And I find that it's possible to just about close out everything else. And it seems to me, in retrospect, that by doing that, I'm placing my faith in a higher level. When I'm flying an ocean, I find occasionally that I may say, Lord, if today's the day, I'm going to meet you fine, but let's postpone it if possible.
With rime ice building steadily, we descended to 5,000 feet in an attempt to melt it. Lunch, though a necessity, was never really enjoyable for me. A daily repast of peanut butter and cheese crackers, dried banana and plastic-tasting chocolate chip cookies did not quite match the culinary standards of those third-rate commercial airline snacks. What is more, drinking was out. There was one important facility missing on this plane. Much of the flight was without any radio contact with the outside world. But finally we contacted Juliana Radio. We were directed to descend towards a radio beacon out on a lonely rock off the southwest coast of Greenland. This was the outer marker for an approach to Narsassuaq.
Now, I have to admit that when you look down on that cold North Atlantic that's full of ice, and there's no land anywhere for hundreds of miles, it's a little bit of a strange feeling, but I find that cockpit a very comfortable place to be. I think that my Christian commitment over all of my life has probably been good background for this.
At first, we were uncertain as to which fjord to fly up. We seemed to be getting confused signals from the radio beacons. Finally, after circling a beacon and careful examination of the topography and charts, we found our way into the right fjord. We had been led to believe that the airfield was tiny and in a box canyon, presenting a one-shot approach. To our surprise, a massive piece of concrete presented itself, with more than ample room for 10 Romeo to fly circles if necessary. Our time in Greenland was all too brief. We refueled with what turned out to be the most expensive avgas of the trip, $4.66 a gallon.
You have a route here. This route, standard route, going south.
We were to fly out the way we had arrived, and then follow the coastline under visual flight rules until we rounded the southern tip of Greenland. At which point, we were to climb to our instrument flight plan route.
We can take off anytime we like.
Okay, good.
Rather than gaining altitude, we roared down the fjord at full power, watching ice floes and fishing boats disappear behind us. As we left the confines of the rock walls, we climbed to 3,000 feet, and there, off the wing, was a huge glacier. It drew us like a magnet. We dropped down to the foot of the massive tongue of ice, then began the long and exhilarating climb towards what seemed like the roof of the world. The course we took was more direct than the original and should have been faster than the planned route. The weather seemed perfect and we could see for miles. As we zigzagged up the glacier, it became apparent that we were getting lift from a 50 to 60 knot headwind. 10 Romeo rose like an elevator. Mill and I became totally engrossed in the majesty of the mountains and the glacier. We were so close to the ground that none of our communication or navigation equipment worked. But Mill wasn't worried at the time because visibility was so good, and once on top of the cap, he reasoned that all the instruments would come online again. As we climbed through 8,000 feet, a cloud bank seemed to roll out of nowhere and engulf us. Mill decided the best course of action was to continue our climb to 11,500 feet to be sure of clearing the mountains, or at least until we broke out into the sunshine, whatever came first. It would not have been wise after on the climb to lose ground by heading anywhere but east and up. Iceland was still a long way off. At the time, we talked about the safety of this action. Back at Saserac, Mill said he had checked the flight plans of all the other aircraft flying similar routes, and none conflicted. We reached 11,500 feet, but didn't break out of the cloud. Mill wouldn't go higher since the plane had no oxygen, and we already felt the effects of thin air. What was most alarming was that none of the radios or navigation equipment seemed to work. We now flew by dead reckoning alone.
I find that often if I find myself in a very tight situation, I will commit my efforts to the good Lord and do the best I can, and it works out pretty well.
By the time dead reckoning put us over the Atlantic, we both were feeling the effects of altitude. Already over 90 minutes late reporting for our IFR clearance, we descended to 5,500 feet. Still, our radios and navigation equipment failed us. At 63 degrees 41.4 minutes north, 36 degrees 26.8 minutes west, the Loran finally came back online. A terrific explosion echoed through the aircraft. Mill scanned his instruments in an instant. The engine sounded fine. I looked over the wings. Everything looked okay. Then I scrambled to the back of the cabin to check for structural faults, only to find an exploded soda can by a heater vent. Other cans were showing signs of going the way of the first, so I put them by a cold vent to avert the next big bang.
If you really wanted to come down to the very bottom line, I would say that in the process of looking forward to how best I might serve what time I have left, given the kind of condition that our world is in today, increased understanding between Soviets and Americans, to my way of thinking, probably is one of the most important needs that this society of ours has. And I would say that probably I believe this to the extent that perhaps it is a very strong function or part of my religious conviction. When you come down to the bottom line, what is there to do? We can all sit and twiddle our thumbs and gnash our teeth, but it seems to me that's not very productive. Or we can do our best to think of innovative ways to make some small increment of improvement in terms of human understanding. And it's, I think, this that's a bit in the commitment that I have.
This was our first sight of the sun since Goose Bay. It was sinking over the North Pole, a bizarre experience for someone from more southern latitudes. We finally made direct contact with Reykjavik Oceanic Radio. The controller's first question was, "Is everything running okay?" They were worried about us. It was good to know that someone on the ground was watching out for us. We were vectored in towards Reykjavik for a VFR approach by Keflavik radar. It was quite odd looking down at a landscape that was illuminated by early twilight at midnight. At last our wheels touched firm ground again. Elapsed time from Narsarsuaq, 5 hours, 40 minutes and 8 seconds. Flying time for the day, 10 hours, 48 minutes and 20 seconds. The airport hotel beckoned us across the ramp. Morning brought the necessary tasks of refueling and inspecting 10 Romeo. Weather briefing and flight plan filing was handled by one man in a small office next to the hotel. Climbing to 7,000 feet, we were able to see some of the splendor of Iceland. Rivers and streams swollen with snow and ice melt cascaded across a green and rocky landscape. Not at all what I expected for Iceland. Fluffy clouds capped the scene, inspiring a feeling of awe and well-being in our place in the clouds. Mill was in heaven. As that misnomer Iceland fell behind us, we looked onward for Scandinavia, still many hours across the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. By using the localizer beacon and cross-checking with the Lorand Sea, we confirmed passage over Vagar in the Faroe Islands. This was later to prove to be yet another world record, with an elapsed time of 2 hours, 40 minutes and 5 seconds from Reykjavik. A glory ring. There below us on the cloud tops was a shadow of the plain surrounded by a perfectly circular rainbow. We crossed that magical line for navigators, the Greenwich Meridian, at 61 degrees 12 minutes north. This is where east meets west, and we were heading for the heart of the eastern hemisphere. Shortly afterward, we sighted 2 oil rigs through the clouds. I suppose the proximity of other people had a calming effect on Mill, for with 100 miles to go before we flew over land once more, Mill fell asleep.
I just have a feeling that an awful lot of people think that this is quite an event to fly the North Atlantic, and it isn't really. Not with today's equipment. It's a piece of cake.
The North Atlantic was finally behind us. Hour upon hour of desolate ocean where even I, as the eternal optimist, wondered what would have happened if the engine had seized up.
The obstacle that will be faced on June 18th will be really a basic indication of the reliability of whether spending 2 years in negotiating with Soviet officials can result in bringing about a miracle. I've had people tell me that it's an absolute impossibility to do what I've been trying to do. And yet I've had 5 trips to the Soviet Union to plan this. The last trip last week I just returned home from, I got no definitive answers.
If he had not had prior experience in the Soviet Union, which he did in the late 50s. As a scholar, he probably never would have had the sense of efficacy to even have attempted this. Even, I think, an extremely naive person in the West would know that their bureaucracy is terribly cumbersome, and that gaining permission to do something so unusual, so unorthodox, could be an endless task, especially if attempted from abroad, through diplomatic channels. So in effect, he was probably himself providing the connective between the various detached parts of the bureaucracy, which under the best of circumstances would not have had lateral means of communication to deal with this kind of proposal or decision, which normally would not arise.
General aviation is really not understood in the Soviet Union. You know, it's foreign to them. In that society, they don't use airplanes the way we do here. And general aviation is really not an experience they know much about.
And as a matter of fact, as I spoke with the Soviet Aero Sport Club about the possibility of having them sponsor this trip, which would make it much easier, they indicated that they really weren't sure that they knew how to do this. And I said, well, make an exception. They said, well, we're not very good at making exceptions. But they said, you know, if you would like to fly in for some competition on August 18th, we'd be glad to invite you. And when I went back to the U.S. Embassy and talked with my contact there, Mike Mosier, Mike suggested, you know, it might not be too bad an idea to scratch your June 18th trip and set it up for August 18th. And there really was no way that I could see doing that, because I think in dealing with human beings or governments, reliability is a very important and critical concern. I made my decision on November 21st to make this flight on June 18th, and I have now had 2 trips to try to solidify and lock in this date. If it's going to be canceled, it'll be canceled by the Soviet Union, not by me. It seems to me that this is one of the kinds of problems that we are dealing with between East and West. The function of reliability is terribly critical.
Leaving the coast of Norway and heading directly across the mountains to Oslo, we were directed to climb to 9,000 feet. Our ascent caused some icing, but once at altitude, skimming the cloud tops, the problem rectified itself. The cloud cover afforded us only brief glimpses of the mountain tops capped in snow and ice. As we let down towards Oslo, a beautiful green landscape presented itself. The coastal area looked like a haven for sailors. Boats were dotted everywhere.
Number 10 Romeo, expect to land runway 24 to wind S27, so 6 feet.
As with all our previous stops, the formalities were brief to the point of being almost non-existent. In the control tower later, Mill explained his takeoff procedures to the air traffic controller. Our flyby the tower marked the beginning of the race to Helsinki in Finland. As usual, we flew at full power. One has to have supreme confidence to hammer an engine like that. Mill placed the utmost trust in American engineering. Trust seemed to play a major role in the negotiations for this flight.
I think they would be very reluctant to have a single-engine aircraft wandering around in their airspace unattended. One of the safety factors that should eliminate their distrust of any kind of American entrepreneur that wants to make this kind of a gesture of friendship is placing one of their own radio men and navigators aboard that aircraft of mine. Last year, they said no to my flying from Oslo, Norway, to Moscow, because they said there wasn't room for but one Soviet crew member.
Last year's seat shortage was due to the installation of 2 auxiliary fuel tanks. This year, 10 Romeo was fitted out to allow for a total of 4 people to be carried and thereby avoiding any problems. A routine check of instruments revealed that our left fuel tank gauge indicated empty. This was somewhat perturbing as the tank had been filled in Oslo. With 2 possible choices, we decided that it was a gauge malfunction rather than a hole in the tank. Showing no signs of concern, Mill took time out to take in the Scandinavian sights. As we approached Helsinki, we were vectored for a pass directly across the field for a flyby the tower.
I can tell you that if I don't make it this time, I'll find other things to do than banging on the door if I can't open it just a small crack.
Important decisions, especially ad hoc decisions, tend to get passed up in the system because individuals in the system do not want to take responsibility for path-breaking developments. And a proposal to fly into the Soviet Union in a small airplane would be a highly unusual development.
Somebody, Steve, to allow 10 Romeo to fly into Moscow has to go way out on a limb. Because it hasn't been done before. It's a kind of an airplane that's unusual. I will be flying at 6,000 or 7,000 feet instead of 30,000 feet. I mean, this is a non sequitur when you've got satellites that can read a license plate in a parking lot. But what I'm saying is that this is unusual and different enough so that whoever it is that puts their name on that piece of paper that allows this flight, I think is taking a risk.
Our pass by the tower was somewhat higher than we would have liked, but traffic precluded us from a high-speed pass at low level across the field. On the ground, business was speedily attended to. Refueling took place almost immediately, and both customs and immigration officials met us at the plane for clearance. This was just the first indication of the highly efficient and willing help we were to receive from all the Finns encountered during our stay. We were expecting to find visas and other travel papers waiting for us at our downtown hotel. However, there was not so much as a message. Somewhat concerned, Mill called his wife to check on the situation. She reported that according to information given to her, the visas were in transit by courier. On Monday morning, we searched out a travel agency that had been recommended to us in case of complications with our travel arrangements. Arthur, an agent for long tours, took on our problem. Careful research found that our courier package was probably in Amsterdam, awaiting an onward flight to Helsinki.
Getting a visa to go to the Soviet Union for anything other than the routine tourist trip, especially if you're in a group, is always sometimes a cliffhanger. And the more singular the event is, the more cliffhanger they make it.
As Mill filed his flight plan to Moscow, the flight briefing staff had little confidence that it would be accepted. After all, a small private plane had never flown to Moscow from Helsinki before. Being eternally optimistic, Mill and I went to the plane to take some photographs for the scrapbooks. Back at the hotel, Mill received a message to call flight briefing.
Yes, briefing, this is Millard Harmon.
The lady on the other end of the phone was apparently elated to pass on the amazing news that 10 Romeo's flight plan to Moscow was approved.
My request has been cleared. Into Moscow tomorrow. Bless your heart. And what time are they suggesting we leave?
A further fruitless visit to long tours precipitated a decision by Mill to take off for Moscow with only mandatory Soviet personnel.
The only real problem that we'll have is if the Soviet navigator asks me if I have my visa. Now, fortunately, the Soviet Foreign Ministry has approved the flight. That means they know there's a visa issued. That means they know there's a place for me to sleep in Moscow. So at this point, I think it's time to go and worry about the mechanics of where to sleep and how to clear a visa and customs later.
I was to remain in Helsinki to pick up the wayward visas and take a commercial flight to Moscow. Then I would arrive in Moscow shortly after Mill and could iron out the problems. That night, Mill pored over his charts and routing information, checking over and over every detail, leaving nothing to chance.
The time the Fisher cut bait's going to occur at about 7:30 on the morning of June 18th on the ramp at Helsinki.
Next morning, exactly half an hour before the scheduled departure, a Soviet navigator by the name of Vladislav Zakharov arrived at the business flight's terminal. Just 5 minutes and 20 seconds behind schedule, 10 Romeo took to the air on its epic flight to Moscow. Had bureaucrats in Moscow known of his illegal status crossing into Soviet airspace, 10 Romeo and Mill would certainly have been turned back.
I would say yes, he probably did the right thing in terms of his objective, though it entailed a certain amount of risk because they take a very hard view of people who cross the border without authorization, even inadvertently. Quite often the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. It's a huge bureau. It encompasses almost every aspect of Soviet life, and of course in this case Soviet external relations. And it's entirely possible that the Ministry of Civil Aviation, which granted permission for the flight, was not in good coordination with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which controls the issuance of visas. And it's entirely possible to say yay and the other could say nay, and neither might be in touch, so that neither would know what one was saying.
My wait for the Amsterdam flight proved to be in vain. I was left high and dry in Helsinki. Mill was to face the music alone. Finally, a telex arrived at flight briefing confirming 10 Romeo's arrival in Moscow at 11:51 GMT, but there was no word of Mill. Whatever was to transpire from that point on would not alter the fact that Mill was the first private pilot to fly his own light plane into Moscow from the west. This was one of the goals that Mill had fought so long and hard to attain.
It's a judgment call. It's a tough one to call. It certainly entailed a lot of risk by doing it, but I think he probably by then knew enough about the Soviet bureaucracy to know how hard it was to get that permission, as you said, several trips. If he failed to follow through on the Civil Aviation Ministry's permission to fly that route with the Soviet navigator, he might not have gotten it again. The mood, the public mood might have changed. A different set of bureaucratic personnel might have been aboard who would have looked askance at the proposal. He may have reasoned, I'll go with it, see if when I arrive, if perhaps the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has gotten the visa processed, perhaps it's there awaiting me. In any event, I have permission to get there, though I don't have permission formally to enter the country, to cross the frontier at the airport.
On Wednesday morning, I called Ruth Harmon to tell her what was going on.
In a way, I was very glad to get your call, because Mill had been calling me every evening, and I didn't get a call from him that evening. So I really didn't know what was going on. And when you called, at least I knew he had taken off, that he had gotten the clearance and had taken off. That was like at 3 in the morning, our time. And so I spent 4 hours trying to figure out what to do. You had said maybe I should get in touch with the State Department. Well, I didn't think they were involved with hostage problems at that time, and I didn't think this was important to try to get to them in the middle of the night.
It was Thursday, 48 hours after Mill's departure from Helsinki, before I heard from the American embassy that Mill had been located. He was in detention at the transit hotel at Sheremetyevo Airport, but release was likely the following day.
Basically, I was so glad that they were following established diplomatic-type rules rather than it was in the Mideast or something like that, where no rules seemed to apply at all.
Like the preceding days that week, Friday was warm and sunny. A visit to one of the nearby outdoor cafes, along with a message from the U.S. Embassy declaring Mill's imminent release, served to raise my spirits. Getting impatient, I went to the airport for more news. Flight briefing told me that no flight plan had been filed, which was a little disconcerting. Then a telex came through saying 10 Romeo's departure was delayed. Finally, in mid-afternoon, a Finnair captain reported radio contact with 10 Romeo en route to Helsinki. Much relieved, I filed an onward flight plan to England, the first stop on our return trip to the United States. With a thunderstorm on his tail, Mill brought 10 Romeo into Helsinki with a far, steep approach. Taxiing to the terminal, 10 Romeo seemed to swagger with pride at a job well done. Mill was slow extricating himself from 10 Romeo, his drawn face showing some of the hardship he had endured for the previous 4 days.
And really, I was thrilled when he had wanted to do this for so long. that he had gotten the clearance. It had worked out in terms of the plane clearance and the Russian navigator and all, just the way he had hoped it would. The visa was another issue, really, but it's harder to get plane clearance for your single-engine plane than to get visas.
I had arranged to refuel immediately, but found that overzealous Soviets had filled the right wing tank with what smelled to me like heating fuel. This ever-helpful fueling crew set about draining, cleaning, and refueling the tank. Progress was slowed by passing thunderstorms.
When we arrived in Moscow, they asked if I needed fuel, and I did a quick chemical calculation, and I found we'd use 60 gallons, which left 80 for the return trip. And I was ready to say, nope, we're all set, and then I realized that if we'd have had a heavy headwind on the 21st, we might have needed more than 80. So as a reserve, I asked for 10 gallons. And the generous Russians decided to fill it up for me and only charge me for 10. So this gave us a problem on the way back because the cooling fuel that was coming in when we were using the internal tank had to come into this system here on the right, which I wasn't using, and this meant that we were dumping gas all the way back.
During the fueling episode, Mill and his Soviet navigator, Vladislav Zakharov, waited in the terminal. Vladislav agreed to deliver this gift of friendship to his employers at Aeroflot since Mill had been unable to. The delay in fueling combined with days of anxiety drained Mill. We decided to put up in the airport hotel before continuing the homeward journey. That night, before finally succumbing to sleep, Mill talked to me of his experiences in Moscow.
My primary feeling is it's delighted. It's just a delight to be back where I can relax and be out from under lock and key. Well, the real problem in Moscow was that, as you know, we took a risk leaving Helsinki without visa. And while I expected that visa to be in Moscow about the same time I was, thanks to your picking it up as we were told it would be here, arriving in Moscow leaves the person pretty much persona non grata when you don't have a visa. And the result is that as soon as I got to Moscow, I was switched off to the area that's reserved for people without visas. These often are transient people, but they're also people that, for whatever reason, don't know any system well enough to be able to manage it. And the result is that the security is very tight. Perhaps this is an opportunity to deal with Phil Brennan's office on a personal basis and say, hey, your people make an assumption when they issue visas that people are going to get on a jet airline that will get them to their entry point within 24 hours. And if you're flying a light airplane, it takes 5 days to do that. There's no way that you and I could have had our visas in hand given the fact that those visas are held so tight. Perhaps we can make a small break in this kind of policy that will make it easier for those who follow. And incidentally, I made arrangements last year for that record to be shared with the Soviet Union. I can't talk about the expense. I can't think of anything that's more appropriate if one's really trying to generate hands across a iron curtain than to have an American pilot and a Soviet navigator sitting on top of a very unique and unusual record.
Within a few short months, Reagan and Gorbachev were sitting in the same room in Geneva. They talked like old friends long parted by a bitter feud, but determined to reinstate their friendship. At the same time, Mill made a return visit to Moscow.
I was amazed to find the kind of access to Soviet media that the friendship flight had generated. It was amazing the way that Gostel Radio, the openness, the receptivity that I met with Gostel Radio, with Novosti News, with TV, Soviet TV. There was an interview on the streets of Moscow talking about this flight. You know, when I made the November trip, I got my visa 1 month in advance. When I arrived in Moscow and mentioned this to some friends and Soviet friends in Moscow, they said, Dr. Harmon, this is as close to an apology as the Soviet government will ever give you. And, you know, being an eternal optimist, which I guess one might describe me as, was probably helpful because I was quite certain that there would be a miracle of improved East-West relationships, and I felt certain this would come from the summit.
Asked if Friendship Flight helped in the big picture of aviation awareness and accord between the countries, State Department negotiator Samuel Kiter said,
Again, I think it's a manifestation of a disposition on the part of the Soviets, another manifestation of which has been the improvement in aviation relations, rather than itself leading to the improvement in civil aviation relations overall.
There's no doubt about it that it was a positive benefit. His flight, had it been turned down, could have had an ill effect. It could have had a deterrent to future negotiations.
You see, we have a way of determining this since I represent the United States in the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, which is you might say, the aero club of the world, and it's the international organization of the various aero clubs. And we have most all of the Iron Curtain countries represented in the FAI. And it's very easy to see that there's been a correlation between a warmer atmosphere there just around the time that these flights were taking place, and since.
We are all children of the same world, and I think your flight across the seas to Moscow was a nice gesture on behalf of the United States of America. It was nice for us, the home of aviation, to be able to send some tokens of our heritage and our community to the Soviet Union. Who knows, someday the mayor of Moscow and the mayor of Dayton may have a chance to shake hands with each other. And I think if and when that day comes, we can finally say this world is at peace.
When I retired 2 years ago, I began to give some serious thought as to how best I might spend the balance of my time, whether it's 10, 20, or 30 years. And it seemed to me at that moment that probably the East-West problem is the most critical problem we're facing today. And on that basis, it seemed very appropriate to me to use my interest, my special skills in flying, if you will, as well as my resources, to try to chip away at an improvement in that very complicated mix.
Funding for the production of Friendship Flight was assisted by Hannay Reels, Westerlo, New York, and by Turbine Services Limited, Ballston Spa, New York, and by Carl Grimm of Troy, New York.